Hello, everyone. Let me get my screen up so I can see. So just a little background, I can see that a bunch of my family is on the call, which is nice. I've been doing Sorrento history for a number of years, and during COVID last year, I decided to finally put some of the things I had found into a blog to sort of share some of the research. And so you can find more about this topic and lots of other stories on the blog, and you can probably just Google Sorrento history blog, and it usually comes up. So the topic of the story tonight is the Sorrento real estate auction of 1927. And before I get into the whole story, I'd just like to take the time to welcome everybody, and also want to again ask everyone to maybe consider supporting the Historical Society, either by becoming a member or by volunteering your time with their efforts to preserve the local town histories of Sorrento and Sullivan. The Society has preserved lots of important documents, including things like this poster from the auction, which they've got in their collection. Raina, who organized tonight's talk, can give you any more information about joining the society or volunteering or helping out with scanning projects, those type of things. I don't know also if Karen Sieber is on the call. Karen and I collaborated on an article that's going to be coming out this spring for the Mount Desert Historical Society's latest journal, that focuses on questions of historical what ifs. And Karen and I did some parallel research, and she was sort of instrumental in getting all of my thoughts better organized and put into the context of larger events in African American history. And Karen, I don't know if you're here or not. If she's not here, she may have had a conflict, but if she's here, please jump in at any point if you hear me going off track. So to start, I'd like to give you a little background on why I first began to get interested in the history of Sorrento to begin with, and how I learned about this fascinating little story. I've spent summers in Sorrento for my entire life with my family, and history has always been an important subject to our family. Our father, George Younger, was not only a minister, but also an expert in Baptist history. And when he began to take his vacations in summer and to Sorrento in the summer, he also took an interest in the area's history, and he collected local maps and books, which we all sort of had in the house and would read at times. More than 30 years ago, I bought copies of these two maps that you see, the map and the auction sale poster. They're reproductions that were done by someone in town. And I had both of them framed. One was the poster advertising the auction, and I gave that to my parents, and they hung it in our cabin in Maine. And the other was the survey map. I kept that survey map and I hung it in my house. And I was always fascinated by that map, which shows the acreage that was for sale in 1927 during the auction. And in addition, it shows all the shaded lots that were not for sale. And it really shows the extent of development, which really could have taken over the lower part of the peninsula in Sorrento. And I took particular interest in one little shaded area down toward the bottom of the map, which is on Doan's Point, where our house is, our little cottage. And that was a shaded portion, which I'd never quite understood why it was shaded and not for sale at the auction. And that sort of sparked my interest in the history of Sorrento and trying to learn more. So about 15 years ago, when my kids had grown up and I needed a small hobby, when I wasn't going to baseball games and basketball games, I started to do some online research about Sorrento, beginning with trying to see what I could find out about that one little acre. And this was a time when collections were just beginning to get digitized and posted on the internet. Things like books and magazines and deed records, newspapers. And I'd been a history major in college and always liked a good research assignment. And before the internet, research was a lot harder. You had to sit in libraries and go through microfilm. And I was sitting at my kitchen table doing Google searches and learning lots and lots about the history of the town. One day, quite by chance, I came across an article in a 1927 edition of Time magazine. And the headline told a story that I'd never heard, and it was frankly amazing. Inside on page 10, under the headline, Negroes Near Bar Harbor, was a brief story detailing news that an African-American New York real estate agent named John Nail had acquired the option to purchase property in Sorrento, Maine. Sorrento was described in the article as a place where people rich and respectable, rather than smart, stay for a few weeks or a month or two. The article went on to explain that Nail was planning to organize a fashionable Negro summer resort in the town. And a footnote indicated that in addition to being a real estate operator, that John Nail was a director of the NAACP. So when I stumbled across that article, I was astonished, since it was a story I'd never heard recounted about Sorrento. And I wondered how this important chapter in not only Sorrento history, but Black American history could have remained forgotten for so long. And it was even more astonishing for another family reason. Our parents and a few of our neighbors in Sorrento had spent the bulk of their lives working in urban ministry programs in New York City, beginning in the 1950s throughout the 60s. Our parents were on the Lower East Side, and our close friends were in East Harlem, and were all involved in the civil rights struggles of the 1960s. And it sort of amazed me that this important history about Sorrento, a place they loved so much, could have remained undiscovered and had such a close tie back to their own professional work. So getting over my initial astonishment, I went on a deeper dive into the story to see exactly what I could learn. And it turned out that there was so much more that I didn't know, not only about the people involved in this era in Black history, but also about the history of Sorrento. And again, this is the early 20th century, before the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And one of the first things I began to research was who John Nail was, the real estate developer. And I wanted to know more about his background. I wanted to know more about what may have led him to the auction of the Sorrento land and the opportunity he saw to open a Black-owned resort in Down East Maine. So a little later, I'll go through what I discovered about John, and hopefully leave you all with a little broader appreciation, not only about his life, his associations, and the broader world that he moved in, but also a bit about the obstacles that he encountered that ultimately ended the dream that he had to open a resort on the coast of Maine. So before diving into the 1927 story, let me set you up with a real short background on Sorrento and what led up to having large portions of land. There was about 600 acres of land that were put up for auction in 1927. Most everyone here is probably familiar with the local geography, but anyone who isn't, Sorrento is located on what used to be known as Waukegan Neck and looks out over several islands and beyond to the mountains of Acadia. And the peninsula was once part of the town of Sullivan before it broke away in 1895. And that's yet another tale why it broke away from Sullivan. I've written a bunch about the details of the early histories, including some of the story of how Sullivan and Waukegan Neck got their names. So if you want to learn any more about that, feel free to visit the blog. The town of Sullivan was named, of course, for Daniel Sullivan, whose home was sacked by the British during the American Revolution. He was captured, held captive on a prison ship in New York Harbor called the Jersey, a famous British prison ship. He did not survive the war and died before ever returning back to Maine. After the Revolution, the men he'd recruited for his regiment were among the many settlers who, in around 1804, were granted land when the town was formerly known. The town formerly known as New Bristol was chartered by Massachusetts, and the families that settled in the area established saltwater farms. They fished. They engaged in industries such as timber. Daniel Sullivan had a sawmill at the head of what's now Long Cove. And by the middle of the 19th century, another important industry came to Sullivan, and that was silver and copper mining. And there were over a dozen companies established in the 1870s in the area. And this map is a view of Sullivan in around 1870 during the mining era. And if you look closely, you can probably see names on the map that you recognize, and many of them trace their presence in the area back to their association with Daniel Sullivan. Names like Bean and Preble and Bragdon, Simpson. In 1886, the resort in the middle of the Gilded Age was established, the resort of Sorrento on Waukegan Neck. And this was during a period when all the land around Bar Harbor began to be split up and sold for summer cottages. There was lots of activity on around Bar Harbor. Hancock Point was subdivided in around 1883. Winter Harbor came a little later. If you're really interested in this period, I've actually documented a lot of this and attempting to move through the history. So more details about those early years of Sorrento are on the blog. I've gotten through about 1887 so far. There's more to come. And the company that purchased the land to establish the resort of Sorrento was started by two brothers, Charles and William Lewis. They were the movers behind this company. They were born in Bangor, and the Lewis brothers were involved in many ventures over the years. But after the Civil War, they were drawn to Sullivan during the mining boom, where they headed several companies that attempted to capitalize on the copper and silver mines. They issued stock in the companies, they hired employees, they pushed the companies, and the stocks went up and they quickly went down. Whether this was purposeful or not, nobody will ever know. After their failures in mining, they moved into land speculation in the area, and they established a holding company called the Frenchman's Bay and Mount Desert Island Land and Water Company. And among that company's first ventures was the purchase of the Waukegan House, which was at the head of Sullivan Harbor, where today's Dunbar store is. They then moved to purchase land on the point on Waukegan Neck, and they hired a landscape architect, surveyors, and established a resort called Sorrento. Lewis actually wasn't the first person to have the idea to buy the land on Waukegan Neck for sale as summer cottages, but he seemed to have the connections to the area and the funds needed to begin the improvements. Things like roads and a water system, piers, all those things needed to build a new town. These had formerly all been saltwater farms down at the point. So shortly after the resort was established and land began to sell in the new resort, a new slate of officers began involved in the company, became involved in the company. And the most prominent, and the name that most people associate with Sorrento, is the New Hampshire brewer and politician Frank Jones. Jones was born in Barrington, New Hampshire. He attended schools in Barrington, and then he moved to Portsmouth when he was very young and became a successful merchant along with his brother. His personal life is hugely complicated and could probably be its own novel, and someday someone should write it. His primary business, of course, was brewing. He had breweries in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and a large one in Boston. He, by the mid 1800s, he was the largest producer of ale in the United States, not beer, but ale. And in 1896, his breweries produced about 250,000 barrels of ale a year. He was also a politician. Jones was the mayor of Portsmouth, and then he was elected to Congress for 2 terms, including the important term of 1877, when he was voting on the Democratic side during a contested presidential election. He ran unsuccessfully as a candidate for governor of New Hampshire in 1880, and then sort of pulled away again from politics. He had other huge interests. He had interests in the Boston and Maine Railroad, as well as hotels. He owned the Rockingham Hotel, which you can still see in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and he owned the Hotel Wentworth, which is in Newcastle on the point outside of Portsmouth. And during the heyday of Sorrento as a Gilded Age resort, hopefully some of you are watching the HBO Gilded Age series, he and his family built large summer cottages in Sorrento where they spent the summer with their friends, political allies, and he ended up basically controlling the company and the town. They also owned lots of land around town. They owned hunting and fishing grounds that surrounded Tunk Lake on the other side of what's now Route 1. Jones dies in 1902 at the age of 70. And by that time, he seems to have pretty much consolidated his ownership of Sorrento and the company. And like a former president of the United States, it's sometimes difficult looking at all of his properties to separate what was personal property and what fell under corporate control. But Jones had sold his brewery on the London stock market in 1889. He'd walked away with over $6 million at the time and spent that money freely. He left a large fortune to his estate, including the extensive Sorrento holdings. And his will really doesn't talk about Sorrento. His will talks about his other hotel properties, but not Sorrento. And his executors had to then deal with this property. And it was complicated not only because of the size of his estate, but also one predicament. And that was a lawsuit that was brought by his former mistress, Delana Curtis. Curtis sued his estate for over $500,000 for quote unquote services she alleged to have been provided, that she had provided to Jones and his friends for more than 30 years. And again, the story of Jones and Curtis and another cottage in Sorrento that she held in dispute is another tale. But this is just one of the times that Sorrento was saved from large-scale development. And Jones's death in 1902, along with the premature death of his son-in-law, who was Charles Sinclair. Sinclair was married to Jones's only daughter, his adopted daughter. But Sinclair was his business partner and also viewed as sort of his political successor. Sinclair died a few years earlier, prematurely at the age of 50, and wasn't around to inherit the Jones mantle. So after things were delayed for a few years because of the Curtis lawsuit, in the spring of 1906, his executors finally got around to selling the Hotel Sorrento, which was the large hotel that sat at the head of the harbor in Sorrento. The 250-room hotel was sold to two Boston investors, but 2 weeks after the hotel changed hands, it burned to the ground. In 1908, the estate of the Jones family negotiated the sale of the remainder of the family's property holdings in Sorrento to a gentleman named George Grant of Ellsworth. And Grant had lots of business interests in the Ellsworth, Bar Harbor, Hancock area. He owned property on Hancock Point, and you can find his name listed with insurance-related businesses in the Bar Harbor region. And together with a partner named Fred Lineman, he founded the Bar Harbor Bank and Trust Company. For the next 2 decades, Grant and a succession of partners and companies tried to market the land in Sorrento. And however, despite his know-how and the network of wealthy clients, Grant's attempts to market and develop the land in Sorrento really proved unsuccessful. So by 1925, the land and buildings once owned by and controlled by the Jones family had been passed to a company called the Charles A. Mann Realty Company of Manhattan. And Mann's company intended to invest a lot of money to rebuild the resort. And in the summer of 1925, they ran a full-page ad in the Bangor Daily News proclaiming Sorrento as the most beautiful spot on the Maine coast. But it was only 2 years later that the Mann Company's efforts to draw vacationers to the smaller hotels, remember the large hotel had burned, they took some of the other larger cottages and turned those into smaller hotels. They tried to market the land and sort of reestablish the glory of the faded Gilded Age resort. All of that proved unsuccessful. And by the end of the summer in 1927, the company decided to divest itself of its holdings. And so it engaged a firm by the name of Joseph P. Day to conduct a well-publicized auction scheduled for August 20th, 1927 in Bar Harbor. Day was a real estate broker. He was an auctioneer. He'd been successful in selling and developing large portions of land in the outer boroughs of New York City, including the Bronx, Queens, Staten Island. Day had a large estate near where I live in New Jersey, in Milburn, New Jersey, and his gardens, you can still visit the Day Gardens in New Jersey. And Day's instructions were to sell the Sorrento land regardless of cost, value, or price. And the advertisement has a full letter with the instructions, including the sales terms that would require 70% of the purchase price to be paid within 30 days of the auction. And it's important to remember what was and what was not included in the sale. Remember, I mentioned the map, which had lots of lots that were highlighted, which were already owned by summer residents in town. And also, when we think of Sorrento, we tend to think of turning off of Route 1 and entering town. But the land that was included in the auction was only the 600 acres that was owned by the Jones estate, which was focused down toward the end of the peninsula. The poster for the auction also featured many homes and amenities in Sorrento, such as there's the golf course, the library, the swimming pool. But those facilities and buildings weren't owned by the Jones company, and they weren't included in the sale at the auction. But there were several large cottages formerly used as hotels by Mann's company, and all of what is now Treasure Island was all included in the sale. So as I first learned from that Time magazine article, the option to buy the real estate was transferred to a Harlem real estate developer named John Nail. So who was John Nail? The article went on to describe that actually another real estate firm headed by a gentleman named Joseph Edelman had originally held the option to buy the land. And Edelman, in turn, had passed the rights for the option on to John Nail. Whether Edelman was sent on instruction from Nail to appear in Bar Harbor so that perhaps no one would be scared off by the presence of John Nail there making a bid, nobody knows. But Edelman made the bid and transferred it to John Nail. So we answer the question, who was John Nail? It seems like if anyone could garner support for this endeavor, a Black owned resort on the coast of Maine, it was certainly this gentleman, John Nail. At the time, he was a leading Harlem real estate investor. He was also well connected in the city's powerful business circles. He knew business owners, both white and Black. He knew politicians. He was connected to artists, clergy, and even members of his own family were quite influential. John Nail, often referred to as Jack, was born in 1888 in Connecticut, but he grew up in Manhattan, where his father and uncle were both successful African-American businessmen. They owned a high-class hotel, bar, and billiards parlor on 6th Avenue and 28th Street that catered to African-American gentlemen. And in 1903, I found an article where his father was quoted in a newspaper saying that a secret for a wealthy and educated Black man was, quote, to remain as inconspicuous as possible, so far as the white people are concerned. So after helping his father at the hotel for several years, Nail moved on his own to become a broker, a real estate broker for another Black realty owner named Philip Payton Jr., who owned a prominent firm called the Afro-American Realty Company. That was one of the earliest Black-owned real estate companies in Harlem. And a few years later, Nail established his own firm with a partner named Henry Parker. So at the time the land was put up for auction in the 1920s, very few opportunities existed for vacationing Black Americans, despite a growing middle and upper class. And things like the Green Book, which we've all heard about, which aided Black travelers finding hotels, gas stations, and other services, that wouldn't be published for over another decade. So we're talking about a period of time when there was really little infrastructure for Black Americans outside of urban areas. They often had to travel with their own blankets, food, gasoline, and other necessities, knowing that a safe and welcoming environment would be difficult to find. And so we know about many Black resort communities in the United States. There's a famous one called Idlewild in Michigan. There's also Oak Bluffs on Martha's Vineyard. Both of those were established before Sorrento. The one in Michigan was actually owned by whites. It wasn't owned by Blacks, but it catered to hosting Blacks. Martha's Vineyard sort of came out of slaves and servants who were brought along to Martha's Vineyard, who sort of stayed behind. But it wasn't really until the 1940s that it boomed into the Oak Bluffs that became a center of Black culture. So the plans that John Nail had were really unlike anything that anyone has seen previously attempted by a Black businessman. So a little bit more about John Nail's background in New York City. His most significant real estate transaction occurred in 1911 when he represented the St. Philip's Episcopal Church, which was the oldest Black Episcopal parish in New York City. They had extensive land holdings in around 25th Street on the west side, which is where the historical Black neighborhood had risen first in Manhattan, and they wanted to move their congregation uptown. And Nail represented the church in selling the land downtown, and that sale funded the construction of the church's new building, which was designed actually by an African-American architect named Vertner Tandy, and that was built on West 135th Street. And they raised so much money in that sale of the downtown real estate that Nail was able to reinvest the proceeds in 10 Harlem apartment buildings on the same block on 135th Street. So the shift of Black residents from downtown to Harlem in this period around 1911 really wasn't without problems. Nail's company managed the apartment buildings for the church, and he wanted to rent to Black tenants. And in 1911, a group of white tenants sued when they were displaced from the buildings, but a local magistrate judge ruled that he couldn't block the evictions that Nail was making and permitted him to rent to whomever he wished. And Nail wasn't the only developer, of course, but he became one of the primary specialists in renting properties to Black apartment buildings in Harlem. And during that time, the population of Black residents in Harlem would more than double, and established that area of Manhattan as sort of a cultural mecca of African-American literature, music, art, politics. In the early 1920s, Nail was at the center of what is now known as the Harlem Renaissance, right? And this awakening after World War I not only centered on Black culture, music, dance, art, fashion, theater, but also politics, which in turn led to a greater awareness for civil rights. And Nail's brother-in-law was one of those movers and shakers. His brother-in-law was James Weldon Johnson, who led the NAACP during its greatest period of growth. You may know that name because he was the lyricist for Lift Every Voice and Sing, which is the Black national anthem. James Weldon Johnson was not just a musician and lyricist, but he was an attorney and a mover in politics and civil rights of this period. This picture on the left is a picture of John Nail's 1915 Mercer Roadster. And this is a picture that was taken on the Grand Concourse in the Bronx and shows him driving with his brother-in-law, James Weldon Johnson. And an interesting other business venture that Nail was involved with was Black Swan Records, which began in 1921. And this was the first Black-owned recording company. We think of Motown. Well, Motown came in the 1960s. Black Swan came in the 1920s. And it was started with a gentleman who was a partner of W.C. Handy in Memphis. This gentleman's name was Harry Pace. Harry Pace studied in college under W.E.B. Du Bois, and Du Bois is another name that we'll hear again. And the record label was named for a Black opera singer, Elizabeth Greenfield, who was known as the Black Swan. And on the board of directors, in addition to Nail, was James Weldon Johnson, W.E. Du Bois, and they're very famous for their recordings of Ethel Waters, and most importantly, for hiring Fletcher Henderson, who was would later become Duke Ellington's arranger. And Nail's own philanthropic efforts also included establishing the Harlem YMCA and the New York Public Library's Schomburg Center. He was also a director of the Harlem branch of the NAACP. And one of their famous early civil rights marches was the 1917 Silent Protest Parade in New York City. And this was, at the time, the largest civil rights march held in the United States. Hundreds participated in a march down Fifth Avenue that was really in response to the lynchings that were occurring in the United States and the things that were going on with protests against the movie Birth of a Nation and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. So the connection between John Nail and W.E.B. Du Bois, and if you don't know who Du Bois was, he was an educator, writer, and an early civil rights leader. The connection between the two men and the effort to buy Sorrento is pretty significant. Du Bois had actually traveled to Down East Maine on at least 3 previous occasions before 1927. And on those earlier visits, he had spoken to summer residents on Mount Desert Island. And it's entirely possible, I think, that it might have been Du Bois who convinced Nail that this could have been a perfect place to establish an independent Black-owned resort. He knew the area, and he knew it to be both beautiful and remote. Du Bois was a native of Massachusetts. He attended Fisk University, a historically Black institution in Nashville. And in 1895, he became the first Black man to receive a PhD from Harvard. His quote when he received his degree was, "The honor, I assure you, was Harvard's." In 1903, the year that Frank Jones died, Du Bois was invited to Maine to speak for the first time to an audience at Northeast Harbor. And during this visit, he was a guest of Harvard President Charles Eliot. And Eliot, if you don't know, spent several summers camping on Calf Island next to Sorrento, and had in fact wanted to buy land in Sorrento, but was turned away. 1903 was also the year that Du Bois published a work called The Souls of Black Folks, which is a seminal work of his where he introduced a label called Double Consciousness. If you're interested in any of this, I can tell you more about it. but I did a bunch of reading of Du Bois's work, and I'd recommend it to you highly. In 1905, Du Bois was invited back to Mount Desert Island. He was invited this time by a colleague of his, Edward Ware, who was the president of Atlanta University, where he taught. Ware was a summer resident in Northeast Harbor. And on this visit, he was invited by the Shefflins, who at that point didn't own Shefflin Point yet. They were still living in Bar Harbor. And he spoke at the newly constructed Bar Harbor Swimming Pool Club. This visit is really notable because he seems to have made this trip on his way home from the initial Niagara Conference. And if you know anything about the civil rights movement in this early period, that meeting had occurred just a week earlier, and is viewed by historians as probably the most significant event in ushering in the modern civil rights movement. And the principles that were expressed there were used for many years in the movement. And a few years later, in 1908, Du Bois was invited by Jane Addams, who was the founder of Hull House in Chicago and a board member of the NAACP. She invited Du Bois back to Mount Desert Island to one of her benefactors, the Bowens, who lived in a large cottage in Bar Harbor, perhaps to do some fundraising in Bar Harbor. She loved to come to the island and do fundraising. After World War I, Du Bois published another work that he entitled Dark Water, Voices from Within the Veil. And this 1920 book includes some remarkable descriptions of beautiful places in the United States that he had visited, including Lafayette National Park, what is now Acadia, and which had been established a few years earlier. And evidently he had quite an affinity for this section of the coast of Maine. And in one of his chapters entitled Of Beauty and Death, he describes in sweeping detail the awe it inspired in him and what generations of visitors appreciated about the Frenchman's Bay area. I'll just read a bit. Bar Harbor lies beneath a mighty mountain, a great bare black mountain that sleeps above the town. It looms above the town in withering vastness. God molded his world largely and mightily off this marvelous coast, and meant that in the tired days of life, men should come and worship here and renew their spirit. This I have done, and turning, I go to work again. So pretty great words. His book also describes his travels to other areas of the nation, and more importantly, it describes the experience that Blacks had traveling during Jim Crow and the segregation in parts of the United States. And he points out how those problems discouraged Blacks from traveling more widely to see the great sights of the country. Sorrento, had a famous summer resident, the Chief Justice of the United States, Melville Fuller. And there's a direct connection between Sorrento and Jim Crow, as Fuller was on the court and voted in the majority in the seminal Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, which of course institutionalized the doctrine of separate but equal and sort of spelled the end of efforts to limit racial segregation during Reconstruction in the South. And this legacy of this case really cast a shadow over race relations in the United States until the 1950s. But remember also that Jim Crow laws had several other byproducts, both economic and cultural. And among those were that tens of thousands of rural African Americans fled the South and resettled in cities in the North in what's known as the Great Migration. And Black entrepreneurs like John Nail during this period recognized an opportunity to cater to this growing population by opening their own businesses. Blacks no longer had to patronize white-owned movie theaters, hotels, restaurants, funeral parlors. And for entrepreneurs like John Nail, something opening up a resort and even buying land in a Black-owned resort on the coast of Maine, while seemingly a dream, was probably not an unrealistic goal. So in the summer of 1927, at the height of Jim Crow discrimination, sensing an opportunity to develop a resort, they made their offer. And the news of the auction broke in both national and African American publications across the country. 2 weeks after the auction, the New York Times reported that Nail and Parker would lead a syndicate of friends to finance the purchase. And the headline indicated that because of the distance between Bar Harbor and Sorrento, there didn't seem to be any concern on Mount Desert Island to what it termed a potential colored invasion. In Harlem, the Amsterdam News covered the story days later, and it provided a few more interesting details, especially the news that Nail and Parker intended this to be an exclusive resort with sales of estates costing $30,000 to $100,000. And no doubt, anticipating the controversy a Black-owned resort might create, the backers were careful to say that they planned to have only a few families at first and gradually build up sales to the most desirable element. The article also pointed out that the option might end like similar attempts to establish Black-owned resorts in the country and might come to naught. Oh, sorry. But despite those worries, the correspondent wished Nail and Parker well and pointed out that if they could finalize the deal, many well-to-do citizens of color all over the country might welcome a resort. Coverage of the transaction and another Black-owned newspaper had a slightly different slant. In Pittsburgh, the headline said, "Bar Harbor is alarmed." That's exactly opposite of the sentiment that was seen in the New York Times just a little earlier. And they editorialized saying that Bar Harbor was perturbed and filled with a feeling of uneasiness, bordering on alarm. And the paper declared that the people it referred to as Nordic high and mighty, who fear a Negro invasion, should be viewed with amusement, pity, and disgust. It argued that some of these people who were seemingly allies of those seeking civil rights would only practice what if they would only practice what they preached, the Negro lot in this country would be much different than what it is today. The article seemed to conclude in a tone saying that the new owners would be polite, urbane, tidy, and altogether a credit to the section. Some Nordics are as much disturbed as though the state of Maine was going to establish a prison farm next door. It concluded by calling those people who would allow color prejudice to warp their minds as not entirely sane, and described America as being a nation that is really a lunatic asylum insofar as skin color is concerned. But despite the story in the Pittsburgh press exclaiming possible fears about a Black-owned resort, and the headline on the same day in the New York Age that echoed the New York Times saying that there was no excitement over the purchase. It seemed to be a pretty mixed message. To secure financing for the project, Nail and Page had to try to raise the money. And one article pointed to a thought that they were trying to raise money with some of their friends. Ethel Waters and her husband were approached to participate. Paul Robeson and a singer named Florence Mills and a heavyweight boxer named Harry Wills were also reported to possibly be interested in buying estates in Sorrento. So it seemed like they were on their way to doing something. And in fact, they were. On November 2nd, 1927, Nail and a group of friends traveled by train from New York City to Maine to look at the property. The party included a New York City alderman and editor of the Black-owned New York News named George Harris, Eugene Jones of the Urban League, and Thomas Taylor of the Harlem YMCA, and a life insurance executive and Nail's former partner at Black Swan Records, Henry Pace, and also W.E.B. Du Bois came on this trip. A few weeks after this tour, Du Bois sent Nail a follow-up letter together with an account of their recent trip and wrote up a short prospectus seemingly aimed at potential investors, investors that Nail would need if he was going to raise the funds necessary to exercise the option to purchase the land. And remember that Du Bois was familiar with this section of the Maine coast from his earlier trips. And in this prospectus, he describes the area as a combination of mountains and sea, the highlands coming straight down to the water with islands and deep indentations into the land, rolling hills, rocks, trees, and beautiful resorts. And he closes by saying Sorrento is one of the most beautiful places in the United States. He outlines the advantages of the resort with 3 hotels, the golf course, swimming pool, docks, boat landings, a post office, excellent roads, clean water, and most importantly, a population of kindly people without race prejudices. When Du Bois went on to ask in his outline, are there enough American Negroes who appreciate a quiet, exclusive resort of this sort to finance it? So instead of marketing to a few well-to-do purchasers, it seems like Du Bois was proposing to find 500 persons able to invest $1,000 each into the proposition to be what he called part of one of the finest summer settlements in the United States of America. So I've looked at the numbers, and although it doesn't sound like a great deal of money now, at the time, the average salary for Blacks was probably less than $50 a week. So this luxury of land in Maine was probably well beyond the means of most. Indeed, looking at the failures of the prior owners to generate interest in land sales in town, finding 500 persons, white or black, able to spend $1,000 per acre at this time in 1927 was probably pretty difficult. And indeed, it seems that that was the main problem, that Nail was never able to secure the funds necessary to exercise the option. That's my theory. The terms of the auction indicated that he needed to come up with 70% of the purchase price within 30 days. The country, remember, was in the midst of a recession in 1926 and 1927. And it was a daunting challenge to quickly find that type of financing. I can't really see anything else that really prevented them from buying the property other than some sort of financial impediment. There was no local opposition that I can find anywhere. Uh, Nobody else came along to quickly snatch up the property and buy it out from under him. That didn't happen. Just as a short side note, one of the entertainers rumored to help Nail raise the money, Florence Mills, died that November on November 1st at the age of 31. She was a huge, huge star. And 10,000 people turned up on the streets outside of her service that was held just one day before Nail and his group left on their trip to Maine. She had sung alongside Paul Robeson in U.B. Blake's hit musical called Shuffle Along, if you know who U.B. Blake was. 10,000 mourners were on the streets of Harlem that day. So over the next few years, as the American economy faltered and Nail's dream to develop this resort in Sorrento faded, his financial struggles also increased. The next year, I found a letter that he actually wrote to Du Bois. He and Du Bois had some business partnerships in New York City. And they were talking about another real estate in Harlem, and Nail laments in his letter that he had entered business with a lot of ideals, but after 21 years, he was ready to, quote, adjust myself to conditions over which no individual has any control. And even before the stock market crashed in October, he experienced pressures with his investments. In the declining economy, he was forced to charge increasingly higher rents to cover his expenses. And even before October and over the summer of 1929, he was accused by in an article in the Daily Worker of rent slavery when New York's tenants organized rent strikes against his buildings. And sadly, like many during the Great Depression, by 1933, he was forced to declare bankruptcy and really never recovered his real estate holdings. He was able to protect St. Philip's Church from losing its properties to foreclosure. He negotiated a deal with a white-owned company to lease the property from the church, but the church, the terms of the deal required the church to accept no revenue for over 10 years. John Nail would die at the age of 63 in 1947, and his obituary was published in the New York Times, among other places. So to wrap up, what happened to the 600 acres of land in Sorrento? It appears nothing much happened. No other buyers stepped forward at the 1927 auction to exercise the purchase option. And like John Nail, the Mann Realty Company, which controlled the land and auctioned the land, it also didn't fare well during the Great Depression. And by 1934, a Northeast Harbor businessman by the name of Merritt Ober foreclosed on the mortgage that he held on the property. And Merritt Ober is another interesting character. He had lots of properties all over Mount Desert Island. He owned the property in Sorrento, and but he dies suddenly in 1935. And the property then went to his estate, and his family didn't do much with the property. They sold off small portions of it, but the larger portions, it would take more than another decade for them to sell the larger portions of land. So again, the new issue of the Mount Desert Island Historical Society's journal, Chubacco, that Karen and I were asked to write for. We did an article on this that's going to be coming out in a couple months. It focuses on the theme of what if, and there are lots of compelling historical stories, what if scenarios, and this is one local one, and it raises a host of questions. How would have Sorrento evolved if Nail had been successful in buying the land? Could he have established a thriving haven for African Americans like those in Oak Bluffs? How would the families that had been vacationing here for decades reacted? And how would the year-round residents reacted if the land had been sold to John Nail? All those are questions that are those that we can ponder. And ultimately, no one really knows what would have become of his vision. We can only speculate whether it could have sustained itself through the Great Depression, survived other things like the rise of auto tourism. Train travel was on the decline, and people were traveling in cars after the Great Depression. Could it have survived the desegregation of American travel? Could it have survived the encroachment of other white investors? But needless to say, the significance of what it could have meant for Black vacationers if he had succeeded really can't be understated. But it's a question that will never be known. Personally, I like to think that the town, both the year-round and the summer residents, would have welcomed the new owners, especially after Du Bois described it as having a population of kindly people without race prejudices. And another little side story, although it's not well known, there was one other summer resident who may have readily embraced Nail's purchase. And this is yet another story that needs to be told in another hour that at some point I will tell. But very briefly, the women on the right, in the right-hand picture, are Louisa Drexel Morel, who is the widow of Edward Morel, and her sister, Mother Catherine Drexel, who was the founder of the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament and the second American canonized saint. And Louise Drexel Morel and Edward Morel owned a large cottage in Bar Harbor. They also, after Frank Jones died, bought Calf Island. And after her husband's premature death, Louise Drexel Morel sold the large estate in Bar Harbor and began to spend more time of her summer time on Calf Island. She also owned 2 houses in Sorrento. And the story goes that she had a priest who would stay in one of the homes, one of the cottages, and every day he would be brought out to the island to say mass in the chapel on Calf Island. And the Drexel sisters are most famous for using the bulk of their inheritance. Remember the name Drexel, famous banking house. They used the bulk of their inheritance to fund educational institutions for both Native American children and African Americans. Among the many institutions they founded was Xavier University in New Orleans, which is the only historically Black Roman Catholic university. And to bring the story full circle, they also established St. Mark's School, which was the first Catholic school, guess where? In Harlem, New York City, on 138th Street, 3 blocks north of where John Nail established his apartments for the Episcopal Church, the Black Episcopal Church. So it's sort of full circle. As my wife likes to say, all things seem to lead back to Sorrento at one point.